Hi, welcome to the Pre-Snore History Hub. This video is all about why the US failed in Vietnam. So there are many broad reasons as to why the US actually failed in Vietnam. The first of those is for political reasons. So the South Vietnamese government was very unpopular and the Vietnamese wanted a united and independent Vietnam, which the US failed to understand. The VC was well organised and was good at winning local support. And there was the huge anti-war movement going on in the USA. There was military reasons, so VC had good guerrilla tactics. There was the commitment of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese troops. The ARVN had very poor training. US tactics generally failed. The draft meant that US troops were young and inexperienced, and amongst those troops there was low morale, fragging occurred, and drug abuse was high. Cultural reasons, so the US and the South Vietnamese government had little understanding of the agricultural society and way of life of most locals. The US-backed South Vietnamese government was mainly Catholic and alienated the largely Buddhist population, and most Americans could not speak the language. There was also economic problems, so aid to North Vietnam from the USSR and China sent modern weapons. And there was the huge cost of the war in the USA was unpopular and funding was cut by Congress, meaning that the US had to eventually withdraw. Finally, there was geographical reasons. So the US had a lack of understanding of the landscape, the climate, and the plants or animals. So, for example, which ones were poisonous to avoid. So let's have a look in more detail then what the strengths of the North Vietnamese were. So the North Vietnamese understood both their own strengths and the weaknesses of the USA. North Vietnam's biggest strength was political, although familiarity with the geography and culture of South Vietnam were vital too. So the geographical and cultural strengths were the fact that North and South Vietnam had once been one country and many people wanted them to be one country again. Proximity gave them several advantages. One, that the North Vietnamese understood the landscape, climate, and language of the South. Two, those who had fought the French as Viet Minh knew the location of tunnel systems that could be used and enlarged. Three, a significant number of those who left North Vietnam to fight in the South were South Vietnamese who had moved north after the 1954 Geneva Accords. Many still had friends and contacts there. So, in terms of political and economic strengths, public opposition was not an option in North Vietnam. The government was committed to a unified Vietnam. If this meant war, then the country was committed to war. So were the people, or at least they had to act like they were. North Vietnam had other political advantages. The Viet Cong were already established in South Vietnam. North Vietnam could supply the VC and work with them. The VC were very well organised both politically and socially. North Vietnam had financial help from China and the USSR. They sent over $3 billion in aid, much of it in weapons and equipment, to North Vietnam between 54 and 67. Also, Laos and Cambodia allowed the Ho Chi Minh Trail to operate in their countries. Without the trail, the North Vietnamese could not have moved people and equipment into South Vietnam so easily. In terms of military strength, both the North Vietnamese troops and their VC allies were used to jungle warfare. They both used guerrilla tactics and fought small skirmishes to inflict casualties on US and ARVN troops. So, what were the weaknesses then of the USA? So, in terms of geographical and cultural, the USA was a long way from Vietnam. Americans were foreigners fighting in a strange country. Had the same racist attitudes towards the Vietnamese as opponents of the civil rights campaign in the USA had towards Black Americans. Americans in Vietnam also had disadvantages that they did not work hard enough to overcome. Most Americans in Vietnam had very little grasp on what the country was like, even the top US commanders. They used interpreters, making it hard to gain trust and support. They did not understand that villagers would not want to leave their land and the places where their ancestors and family members were buried. They didn't realise that many villagers could not read, which meant dropping leaflets telling them that the area they lived in was about to be bombed was completely pointless. And just to note as well, even if they could read, whether they could read English or not was even more unlikely. Political and economic weaknesses. The US had serious weaknesses at home and abroad. The USA may have said that they were in Vietnam to fight for democracy, but to many South Vietnamese, they were just like the French. They were a foreign nation occupying the country and imposing their own views. The US backed South Vietnamese government was unpopular and corrupt. At the start of the war, many members of the government and officials in the cities and the villages had worked for the French. This meant that they were unpopular with the local people. In the USA, there was significant opposition to the cost of the war. Congress supplied the funding that White House administrators needed to run the country. The military were constantly saying they needed more money to fight the war. By 1971, Congress was setting limits to the amount of money that could be spent on the war, and the military ran short equipment. So, military weaknesses. Many historians argue that the assumptions and mistakes of the military were a significant reason for the US failure. The US military was convinced that the war could be won with more troops and by more bombing of North Vietnam, not by fighting a limited war. They measured success in the war in a way that made them seem more successful than they actually were. For example, they would just measure the number of VC killed or the number of VC bases, which were often just villages, destroyed or cleared. They ignored the fact that the ARVN still did not control large areas of the South. Destroyed bases were simply rebuilt, and burning villages caused resentment. They had been told from Kennedy's presidency onwards to concentrate on counterinsurgency and on winning the support of the South Vietnamese people. However, working with the villagers was never done consistently enough to be effective. The draft meant that the troops on the ground were unusually young and inexperienced. Soldiers were drafted for a year and there was a constant turnover. This meant that experienced soldiers returned home after a year to be replaced by inexperienced ones. The age and lack of experience of US troops, as well as their lack of training in guerrilla warfare, meant that morale dropped during the war. Once troop withdrawals started, many soldiers tried to avoid combat, while fragging and drug abuse became a growing problem. And also, another reason why the US failed was opposition to the war in the USA. So, unlike North Vietnam, the USA was a democracy. President and members of Congress needed public support to be elected. They had to face criticism in the media and from the public. The 1960s were a decade where protests and criticism of the government grew. For the first time, a significant number of people were saying that their elected government was not doing what they wanted. Indeed, both Vietnam and civil rights produced situations where the American public felt ashamed of the actions of their government, police, and their military. The US government tried to ignore public opposition to the war. However, as opposition to the war grew, it became almost impossible for the government to continue the war. It was the first war in which the USA had been involved where a large section of the population did not accept the need for the war at all. Even worse, a growing number of people were actively against it. It was also the first war in which returning soldiers openly campaigned against it in large numbers and even returned their medals. Okay, thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the Personal History Hub.